Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video from Creation Ministries International called 5 Reasons the Earth is Not Billions of Years Old. Did I pick this video because of that one creationist who comments with the name of a video they think I can't respond to on nearly every one of my videos? Yes, but mostly out of laziness. Finding new material that's worth using is one of the most annoying parts of my job. So while there is definitely a bit of, you think I can't, just watch me in this one, it is primarily me being happy that someone did the worst part of my job for me. Seriously, you guys have no idea how much bullshit I've listened to that ended up not being useful to me. But also, the best thing about this person is that if they recommend a video that I happen to have already covered and are informed of that fact, they just move right on to the next one in their arsenal without missing a beat. So, with the warmest of thanks to this person for taking a bit off my plate, let's go!
We constantly hear that the Earth is millions and billions of years old, but Dr. Robert Carter, you're a scientist. That's not what you say. You say the science actually tells us otherwise. And today, you're going to give us 5 scientific evidences that the Earth is actually young.
Okay, we can do that.
Can we do that? This guy does have a legitimate PhD from a real school, unlike a lot of the creation scientists we see on my channel, but if you read his bio on the CMI website, it makes it quite clear that this is a person who had the conclusion that he wanted to believe and explicitly wants his work to back up the conclusion that he started with. Quote, Dr. Carter was converted to Christ at an early age, but did not know what to do with the theory of evolution. He always knew that he wanted to believe, but he had no way to express what he was thinking and no evidence to support his views. In his freshman year of college, he was exposed to the information for creation for the first time and soon after adopted it as his modus operandi. I know it skirts close to poisoning the well to bring this up, but I think it is relevant to know that the guy supposedly giving scientific evidence that the Earth is young is a person who has made it explicitly clear that he starts with that conclusion and works his way backward from there. And I'll be skipping ahead a bit. When we come back in, she's asked him to talk about carbon dating, and he mentioned that he attends a workshop twice a year where they talk specifically about carbon dating from a biblical perspective.
All right, so hang on just a second. You're sorry to interrupt you, but you say that they're biblical answers as opposed to what science says this.
Yes, but what I get to say now is, thank you, Mr. Evolutionist, for inventing carbon dating. That's ours. Go play with something else.
Something I've been noticing more of lately is that there seems to be less of an effort on the part of creationists aimed at hiding the fact that creationism is diametrically opposed to science. It is just straight up science versus the Bible, and we think the Bible wins now.
Go on.
That's how strong I am about this. But carbon dating specifically, not all the other radiometric dating techniques. They have different answers.
Well, thanks for at least mentioning them. That's more than you get from a lot of creationists. The creationist layperson is likely to think of carbon dating anytime any radiometric dating is mentioned, and every single dating method demonstrates that the universe cannot be a mere 6,000 years old, including carbon dating. After all, if the universe were only 6,000 years old, then we wouldn't expect to find, say, artifacts from the North American Clovis culture that reliably date between 12 and 13,000 years ago. And that is but one example of many specimens that have been dated to before the beginning of time, according to the creationist timeline.
But this one, we cannot find any carbon source in the world that has 0 carbon-14.
To anyone familiar with how AMS machines work, the answer here is quite obvious. It's the background signal. To quote a paper that explicitly addresses this concern with carbon dating specifically, quote, every sensitive modern analytical instrument of which we are aware, no matter what type of physical entity such an instrument has been designed to measure, exhibits some type of background or sample/machine blank signal. There is, as far as we know, no exception to this statement. In other words, because of the physical reality of how carbon-14 content is measured, there will always be a detectable level of carbon-14 that doesn't come from the sample, but comes both from the machine itself and the preparation processes used on the sample. Also, if we care to look at that time when creationists carbon dated a bunch of diamond samples and then shouted to the mountaintops about how they found carbon-14 in them, they measured carbon-14 in 2 ways. The first was to process their samples, converting all of the carbon into graphite and measuring the carbon-14 of the graphite. This process will always result in some contamination, but when used on diamonds, they had to modify the process, likely by increasing the combustion time and temperature when processing the samples, processes that are known to introduce contamination even in the most controlled conditions. Even so, the carbon levels that they measured were barely above the background levels, and when measuring their samples without processing them first, they found much lower carbon content. didn't. And for some reason, they didn't subtract the background levels when reporting those numbers. Weird that they subtracted the background levels for samples that likely had extra contamination, but did not for the ones most likely to be pure. It's almost like they knew that they were only measuring contamination in background levels, but wanted to make it look significant anyway.
That means they can't be millions of years old, because carbon-14 breaks down really quickly.
Or it means that the tools we have to measure carbon-14 have some known issues that researchers are able to account for, but that creationist researchers decided not to for some reason.
How quickly?
The half-life is just over 5,000 years. So after 5,000 years, you have half as much as you did before, but there's not a lot of carbon-14. It's formed in the atmosphere, very slowly from cosmic rays. There's always just a little teeny bit. So as plants photosynthesize, they soak in the carbon. As we eat the plants, we soak up the carbon. It becomes part of our bodies. But if you bury something in the ground, it's cut off from any source of carbon-14. Right. It just decays. But we find carbon-14 in coal.
Okay, but now how about you tell us about the upper limit for reliable radiocarbon dating? How long does it take for all this carbon to go away? Bet you he doesn't mention that it's 50 to 100,000 years, depending on the sensitivity of the equipment you use.
The theoretical maximum is about 70 or 80,000 years, and there'll be nothing left.
God damn it, I guess I lose that bet. I don't have any cash on me. Can I pay you in oral sex?
Oh, it's contamination, they say. Well, there are ways to get around contamination. Carbon dating labs know how to do that.
They do that by measuring the background levels for their particular machines, and then that gets included in the dating calculation as background subtraction. Which is why it's weird that the creationist dating diamonds didn't do the background subtraction for the samples that returned amounts that would have been reduced to zero had they done that subtraction. Okay, no, that's not really weird. That's how creationism works. You only do enough science to confirm the conclusion that you started with, and then you stop before the rest of the work shows your conclusion to be wrong. But even after background subtraction, there will still be error bars on the sample, because samples have to be processed before their carbon-14 can be measured, and each step of the processing will introduce some modern carbon. But creationists will fail to account for that, and then when contamination is brought up, just offhandedly dismiss it like this guy is doing, because modern labs don't generally have a problem dealing with contamination. They are aware of the problem, and then rather than correct for it, they use it to nudge their results in the direction that they think supports their worldview.
We find carbon-14 in diamonds that they claim are 1 billion years old. You can't contaminate a diamond, it's a crystal. So where's carbon coming from? Carbon-14 coming from?
It just so happens by miraculous coincidence that the amount of carbon-14 found in the diamonds matches the background level of the machine they use to detect that carbon. But they decide not to factor that into their calculations for unknown reasons.
We find carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Consistently. About the same amount of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones.
And that right there is a huge red flag. Why would you find the same amount of carbon-14 in otherwise unrelated dinosaur bones? I know the creationist answer will be that they all date to the time of the flood, but the fact of the matter is that if you date several different samples from different locations and different strata, and it all comes back with the same measurement, then you're measuring that AMS machine's background level, not the C14 content of the bone. Also, dinosaur fossils are, for the most part, permineralized. That is, the original bone has been replaced over time with minerals. Sometimes those minerals do contain carbon, so as fun as the Potholer 54, "Oi! Carter! You can't carbon date that! There's no fucking carbon in it!" It's not necessarily accurate. Although, to be fair, it is probably accurate most of the time, as the most common mineral involved in permineralization is silica, not calcium carbonate. But if we hypothetically assume carbonate mineralization and ignore the short half-life of C14, then you wouldn't be carbon dating the bone. You'd be dating the mineral that replaced the bone, and so the expectation would be that the fossil would date younger than it actually is. So even if you're right here, you're dating the wrong thing.
So we know these things are not millions of years old. Now, one of those forms of carbon might be, contamination, groundwater leaching of uranium or something, but not all of them. And consistently, all of them are giving us about the same answer. It's telling us the world is not millions of years old.
It's telling you the machines you're using have a background rate that is being selectively ignored. You're also not being honest about where the contamination comes from. Yes, the things that he mentioned are potential ways that a sample could be naturally contaminated, along with the ones he didn't mention, like recrystallization and bacterial activity. But a key fact that he is leaving out is that preparing a sample for carbon dating will always, 100% of the time, introduce some modern carbon, no matter how carefully the samples are prepared. Real scientists will account for this in their calculations. Creation scientists, on the other hand, will pretend that they are the only people on the the planet capable of preparing a sample in a way that perfectly avoids any contamination.
That's a carbon-14 story.
Okay, so you mentioned the dinosaur bones. So
Yes.
I've heard that there's actually been soft tissue found in dinosaur bones.
Yes, and that is a great second indicator of the youthfulness of the fossil record specifically.
Not really. Some microscopic and heavily cross-linked molecules have been found that probably contain material that was original to the dinosaur. While this was surprising when it was first discovered in 2005, it is not unprecedented. Fossil fuels and coalified wood all contain biomolecules that are made of the original material that was present in the living organisms, but chemically transformed into carriage and macromolecules, and this has been known since at least the 1970s. So we know that, in some cases, soft tissues made of material that is original to the organism can persist for millions of years. The significance of finding it in dinosaur bones is not that it was preserved, it is that this was the first time such tissue was discovered in a vertebrate. But even setting all of that aside, if I grant what this guy is saying, that doesn't mean the Earth is young. That means that some species didn't go extinct as long ago as we previously thought. But in order to get there, we have to ignore a shit ton of other evidence that these fossils are old.
There's two types of soft tissue we might see. One might be like the petrification of something soft. There was even Charles Darwin, he wrote, I think in Origin of Species, no organism wholly soft can be preserved.
Yes, Darwin did write that in Chapter 9 of Origin of Species. It was in a section where he was discussing just how sparse the fossil record is. And yes, the fossil record is sparse, but as it turns out, we've learned a lot since 1859. So while it is still sparse compared to what we'd like it to be, it's nowhere near as bad a picture as it was in Darwin's day. Creationists seem obsessed with proving the minutiae of Darwin's book wrong, as though we'd expect a scientist working more than a century ago to have been 100% right about everything. I get that they have one authoritative book that they have to pretend is correct about everything it says, even when it's demonstrably wrong, but that's not how non-creationists treat Darwin. He was just a dude. A brilliant dude, to be sure, but a dude nonetheless. So, yeah, I'm skipping the bit where he lists a bunch of fossils that we found that Darwin didn't think was possible, because who fucking cares?
But then there's the other type of soft part, the non-petrified type. And that's the stuff that really should not be there.
Only if your information is half a century out of date.
Starting off in about 10 or 15 years ago now, there's a large Tyrannosaurus rex they found in Montana.
Maybe this is one of those, holy shit, it's been that long since 9/11 moments that us olds experience now and again. But the paper on that T-Rex bone that you're referring to was published 21 years ago now, not 10 or 15.
And they wanted to fly out the leg bone. They had hired a helicopter, but the helicopter couldn't pick up the leg bone. It was too heavy. So they cut it in half.
Ooh.
Yeah, world-class specimen. They cut it in
Like,
half.
ooh.
And then one of the scientists there, who's now very famous, sampled the inside of the bone, took it back to the lab, decalcified it, using something I've used in a lab when I'm working on corals to get rid of the skeleton so I can study the tissue.
Okay.
She did that with the bones of the dinosaur and was left with soft, flexible tissue.
He's making it sound like they dissolved the whole bone and were left with almost the same amount of soft tissue that you would expect if you used the same process on a modern bone. But the bone itself was reassembled. Dr. Schweitzer, the researcher he was referring to but not naming for some reason, was working with small fragments that were left over after they reassembled the bone. And the soft tissue that she found was in microscopic amounts. I'll leave a link to the Stated Clearly video over on John Perry's channel. It is very well done and tells the story better than Dr. Carter is doing.
And that wasn't a one-off. We've now found soft tissue in multiple dinosaur bones. We know now that there's reports going back at least to the 1960s where science is reporting similar things.
Oh, so he's not out of date with his references. He's just ignoring the parts of all the papers that found soft tissue where they explain how it was preserved for millions of years. Well, maybe he's not ignoring it. Maybe he's going to do the Matt Powell thing where he acknowledges cross-linking but then uses intuition to say, I don't think that accounts for how it could last millions of years, without ever explaining why.
Different places in the world, different types of dinosaurs, mosasaurs, pterosaurs, tyrannosaurs. Yeah, these things are not petrified.
No, they aren't petrified. They are permineralized. But not always fully, just mostly. The thing is, if Noah's flood really were the thing that made most of the fossils, we'd actually expect most fossils to be only a tiny bit permineralized, with extremely rare instances of full permineralization. The fact that reality is nearly the exact opposite of that expectation would suggest that even if these fossils are younger than expected, Noah's flood is still not an adequate explanation.
The soft parts haven't been replaced with rock. They're still flexible sometimes. They still stink.
Well, this is the first I've heard of them still stinking. In every case that I am aware of, the amount of soft tissue is so minuscule that any smell coming off it would be surprising, with the possible exception of Mark Armitage, where he found a shitload of soft tissue in what he claims is a Triceratops horn, but he won't let anyone with any amount of expertise in fossil identification anywhere near the specimen, and he didn't properly document the find when it was in situ, so most likely he's got a bison latifrons horn that has been mistaken for a Triceratops horn. But we won't know until he lets someone who knows what they're doing look at it. I go into more detail on Armitage in a previous Matt Powell video that I made, so go check that out if you want more of that particular story. My point is, I don't think this guy is accurately describing the research on the subject. Shocking, I know.
You can sometimes, some examples, you can squeeze the blood cells out of a blood vessel.
So there's still visible blood cells in there?
Yes.
No. There are highly cross-linked structures that are morphologically similar to blood cells and may contain material that is original to the organism. That is not the same as, yes, there are blood cells. It seems like a minor difference, but it is an important one.
And bone cells, and blood vessels, and fibrous tissue from the skin that hasn't completely decayed yet. It's actually shocking.
Yeah, so what I said about the blood cells, ditto for all of those.
Now, there are ways maybe of helping preserve things over a long time. You know, you put your meat in the freezer, right? You don't leave it on the counter because it preserves it better. But even frozen, things like that don't last millions of years.
Who said anything about freezing it? That's not how anyone is saying they were preserved. At best, that's an example of one preservation method, but it is not the one that anyone thinks is responsible for the microscopic amounts of soft tissue that have been found. It's cross-linking. The mechanism by which the cross-linking happens is not entirely settled yet. It probably has something to do with the iron in the animal's blood, as iron-mediated radical formation is a known method for cross-linking biomolecules, and it probably also has to do with the formation of advanced glycation and lipoxidation end products, which is a process that I won't even pretend to understand and will leave up to the science nerds. To quote the paper that I'm pulling this from, quote, both the iron-mediated radical and AGE/ALE pathways convert original tissue biomolecules into large, highly cross-linked macromolecules. And those highly cross-linked macromolecules are of a sort that are known, and have been known for over half a century, to be able to survive deep time. So whether or not the frozen meat will eventually spoil is irrelevant. But also, meat stored consistently below -18 degrees Celsius will never spoil, so even in his analogy, it could absolutely last for millions of years in the right conditions.
We've been studying this for over 100 years. The study of the breakdown of things over time is called taphonomy. This is a well-known part of science.
So well known that, like I said, it has been known that the original material can survive deep time for over half a century now, as he himself pointed out earlier.
I think these things were buried during Noah's flood. That was 4,500 years ago.
So
That's
you would
a long
expect to
time.
find carbon.
No, I wouldn't expect to find anything. After 4,500 years, I expect it all to be decayed away.
He seems to be very mixed up. Decay and permineralization are not the same thing. And if you wouldn't expect to find anything, even carbon, then the earlier argument about carbon dating is completely moot.
But if I'm incredulous, what's the evolutionist answer to this?
Well, let's peruse the literature a bit and find out, shall we? Soft tissue and cellular preservation in vertebrate skeletal elements from the Cretaceous to the present. Cross-linking. Mechanisms of soft tissue and protein preservation in Tyrannosaurus rex. Cross-linking. Osteocyte and blood vessel microstructures from Eocene fossils. Cross-linking. Organic matter from Triassic reptile bones. Cross-linking. Soft tissue preservation in Mesozoic vertebrates. Cross-linking. Biomolecular characterization and protein sequences of a hadrosaur. Cross-linking. Now, obviously, there is more to it than just saying cross-linking. There are entire papers surrounding the single sentences that I have highlighted here. My point is that the answer, while complicated and hard to understand to an idiot like me who knows jack shit about chemistry and biology, is still easy to find, and a marine biologist should be able to find it no problem.
I mean, I'm surprised. So maybe I was overestimating how fast things break down. Okay, fine. Twist my arm. They can last 4,500 years. But 70 million?
Yeah, okay, he's just doing the Matt Powell thing where he uses personal incredulity at big numbers to make it seem impossible, despite the wealth of scientific literature out there that explains it. Hey, Matt, guess what? You're on the same level as someone who actually has a PhD. What do you think of that, buddy?
Is ludicrous. That's false.
Yeah, that's about how I feel about it too. I'm going to skip it, but he goes on to talk about DNA being found in dinosaur bones, and to the best of my knowledge, there is only one paper that claims to have found dino DNA, and honestly, it doesn't even go that far. They conclude that they found chemical markers consistent with DNA, not DNA itself, and they conclude by saying that extensive research is still needed in this area. So at best, this is a maybe. maybe some DNA managed to survive deep time, in which case we need to reassess our idea of how long it can last as well as find a mechanism for it to survive that long. This doesn't mean that the Earth is young. It means that there might be something about DNA degradation that we just don't know yet. So this is just your typical creationist, if science doesn't have an answer for this specific thing, then all of science has to be wrong even if it's unrelated nonsense. But I do want to include a brief snippet from the bit that I'm skipping, just for shits and giggles.
Now, by the time this video comes out, it'll be a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months old. Reports this week of them resurrecting the dire wolf, an extinct species. But they didn't. They took a wolf and they genetically modified its genome to make it more like a dire wolf, the big wolf that went extinct a long time ago. That's not the same thing as a Jurassic Park.
So apparently he missed what was actually a massive plot point in Jurassic Park where they patched the holes in the DNA with frog genes.
We used the complete DNA of a frog to fill in the holes and complete the code.
Like, that's how they explain how the dinosaurs reproduced. Not saying it's plausible or anything, but cloning a direwolf today would actually be the equivalent of Jurassic Park, but for direwolves instead of dinosaurs.
All right, Dr. Carter, you've given us a couple of scientific examples of why the Earth is actually young. We've talked about carbon dating. We've talked about the soft tissue and dinosaur bones.
Okay.
Fun fact about both of those things, they don't actually point to the idea that the Earth is young. At best, if we take everything he said at face value, it means that dinosaurs existed more recently than previously thought. That's it. Oh, and I guess some diamonds aren't as old as we thought as well. Whoop-de-doo!
So give us a third.
How about radiometric dating in general?
Okay.
Now, most people look at that and say, oh, that proves the Earth is billions of years old. Not so fast.
Because it does. Many samples have been dated to over 4 billion years. Can't be 4 billion years old if the universe is only 6,000 years old, right?
There's many different radiometric dating techniques. Each one of them, carbon dating being one, has a different answer, different assumptions, different applications.
And the thing about all these different methods that use different isotopes and have different assumptions and all that is that we have samples that have been dated using multiple methods and the dates have agreed with each other. For that to happen because of something like contamination or an error in the assumptions is much less plausible than the dating methods just, working. Part of that is because of the different half-lives of the isotopes. If a sample is dated with both uranium series dating and rubidium-strontium dating, if the results agree but are both wrong, that would mean that they both have to have been contaminated by different isotopes in different amounts, specifically to make the ages agree. And so many samples have been dated with multiple methods at this point that the only way for a creationist to save it is to assume that God monkeyed with physics in a way that is completely undetectable to us, with him monkeying in different ways, not just for each isotope, but for each place where we might take a sample to be dated with that isotope.
But when we do real-world testing of radiometric dating, it often fails.
Oh, good. Here comes Mount St. Helens, and or the creationist penchant for pulling up papers about xenolithic inclusions while ignoring the fact that they are, xenolithic inclusions. For the uninitiated, a xenolithic inclusion is a bit of rock that is encased inside another rock. One of the ways this happens is during a volcanic eruption. Some rock will be swept up in the magma during the eruption, but it won't fully melt before the magma cools. This results in an old rock being included inside a young rock, and there are several studies that explicitly looked at dating these inclusions. Creationists like to whip out these studies when radiometric dating comes up to say, hey, this young rock that formed in a recent eruption dated to millions of years old, while ignoring the fact that they are literally dating the old rock that got trapped in the young rock.
Like, for example, some enterprising creationists went to Mount St. Helens in Washington State. They exploded in 1980, so I was in 5th grade. And I remember it. I remember it quite clearly living in New York, the weird skies from the ash in the atmosphere.
What is inevitably going to be important here is that Mount St. Helens did not erupt one single time in 1980 and then stop. The big one in 1980 is the one that everyone thinks about, but it has been an active volcano ever since, with several dome-building events and minor eruptions happening all throughout the 80s.
But they went and sampled the lava dome that formed after the eruption. So it was formed after 1980, and they used the potassium-argon method.
Specifically, the samples they took were from the portion of the dome that formed in 1986, and the lab that they sent their samples to for testing was called Geological Laboratories. And thanks to the paper that he's talking about being published in 1996, we can use the Wayback Machine to take a look at 90s Geocron Lab's website. When we do, we see that prominently displayed on their potassium-argon dating page, they warn that they cannot analyze samples expected to be younger than 2 million years. Now, this guy says that he was 5 in 1980, and he looks like he might just be a smidge younger than 2 million years. So is it perhaps possible that this is yet another instance of creationists dating a sample using the incorrect method, having that method return what is essentially the background level of their equipment, and then assuming that it was actually an accurate measurement? Yep, that is indeed exactly what it looks like.
Works like this. You have lava, there's argon, which is a gas,
Right.
and there's potassium 40. So potassium 40 breaks down into argon 40. The assumption was while the rock is liquid, all the argon is going to boil off. And when it hardens, argon will be building up inside that, but only from the breakdown of potassium.
Correct. Except for various reasons, this process is not always fully completed before the rock hardens, leaving in excess argon. And there are ways to both detect and account for excess argon. In fact, that's one of the reasons there's so much material for creationists to pull from regarding the dating of xenoliths and anomalous dates for young lava flows. It's real researchers figuring out how to account for these exact things.
And
So it should have had according to their
should be
thinking.
zero.
Okay.
Yeah, it should have no argon. They sampled it at 10 million years old.
First off, you're wrong. The study that you're referencing took 5 samples, and the dates returned for them ranged between 340,000 years and 2.8 million years, not 10 million years. But also, I've kept you guys edging on this for long enough, so it's time for me to finish the job. The reason it's important that the volcano has been active the entire time since 1980 is because Austin took samples that were formed in 1986. In his paper, the way he ruled out the idea that the old dates came from inclusions rather than the young rock was by referencing a paper that was looking at rock samples that formed between 1980 and 1983. Austin just assumed that his samples would have been identical to the other samples that formed in different events. But if we put aside the problem there and assume that his samples were identical, then there's another issue. The paper that he referenced pointed out that the most abundant inclusion type contained up to 9% interstitial glass. He acknowledged in his paper that all of his samples also contain glass. Why does this matter? Well, because it's been found that glass contamination of 0.01% is enough to significantly raise the measured age of a sample when using potassium-argon dating. And what's more, the younger the sample is, the more significant the impact will be. So he sent young samples contaminated with potentially up to 9% glass to a lab that wasn't equipped to date young samples and got back anomalous results. This is some really sloppy research, and I didn't even get into the fact that this paper of Austin's is one where he copied data from the wrong column of a table in one of his reference papers, a mistake that has since been copied multiple times by multiple other creationists. Most amusingly by Andrew Snelling in his article, Excess Argon, the Achilles heel of potassium-argon and argon-argon dating of volcanic rocks. Amusing because he had the table reproduced with Austin's mistake, but he didn't cite Austin as his source for the table. He cited the original paper that it came from. So Snelling copied Austin's homework, tried to pass it off as his own, but we can tell he got it from Austin rather than from reading the original paper because he made the same mistake as Austin. Either that or Snelling and Austin are both sloppy enough in their work to have made identical mistakes. Whichever it may be, it doesn't look good for the quality of the work that creation scientists do.
Same thing in Hawaii. I think the lava flow from 1950. Several in New Zealand, 3 historical lava flows, one of the big volcanoes that have gone off since Europeans settled there. So we know those dates of lava flows, and they all date to millions of years.
Hey, guess what? You know that table that I said that Austin fucked up by copying data from the wrong column? It was the table listing those lava flows and their measured ages. But yes, there was excess argon found in those samples. This is merely one of those creationist tricks where they find a paper whose entire purpose is figuring out the limitations of a dating technique and then claiming victory because that dating technique can't be pushed past its limits.
So were these like blind tests that
Yeah.
send the
sample to the laboratory and don't tell them where it came from necessarily. And here's it. The machine gives you a ratio. It measures how much of this and how much of that. That's good science.
Is lying about the science good science? Because the other lava flows he's talking about were not the blind tests that creationists like to pretend work in their favor. It was researchers working out the kinks of the potassium-argon and argon-argon dating methods. I very much doubt that those researchers were lying to the labs that analyze their samples in the same way that creationists are so fond of doing.
So when we ground truth it, the radiometric dating tests usually fail.
What do you mean by ground truthing?
We go to a place we know how old it is because we saw it happen.
Okay,
We sample it. And it fails. That happens a lot.
Yes, when you misuse a dating method, you get wonky results. I skipped a bunch of his explanation, but he's only really talking about potassium-argon dating because that's the one where we can detect excess argon. So rather than saying, hey, researchers can detect excess argon so we can tell when a sample has been contaminated, They say, there is excess argon, therefore this dating method won't work under any circumstances, because we can never know how much excess argon there is, despite the fact that we know of the excess argon because we can tell how much of it is excess. But there are other dating methods, such as rubidium-strontium dating, which use what is called the isochron method. Essentially, any radioactive decay chain that ends at the stable daughter element for which there is an isotope that is not the result of a decay chain can use the stable non-daughter isotope to determine the amount of stable daughter isotopes that would have been present at the rock's formation. So rubidium-87 decays into strontium-87, which is stable. Strontium-86 is also stable, but it is not the result of any radioactive decay chain. When a rock is forming, it does not discriminate between isotopes, so it will include strontium-86 and 87 at whatever ratio they were just present at naturally. But this ratio would not be consistent throughout the whole lava flow, or whatever event created the rock in question. So by taking samples of the same rock from several different locations and comparing the modern ratio of both types of strontium and the ratio of rubidium to the non-daughter strontium, we can not only calculate the age of the sample, but we can determine the amount of strontium-87 that was present when the rock formed, as well as detect any contamination or loss of strontium-87 throughout the life of the rock.
And that's one of the Achilles heels of radiometric dating.
Oh hey, he just title dropped the Snelling article that copied Austin's mistake. It really is quite telling that there's only a small handful of creationist scientists writing a relatively small number of articles that get passed around to the more rank-and-file creationist apologists. And yeah, this guy is a legit marine biologist, despite only having his name on 5 non-creationist papers and 2 patents, the most recent being more than a decade ago, according to his official biography on creation.com. But right now he's talking about geology. That is well outside his area of expertise. So as much as they'll trot out the fact that he has a PhD to try and treat him as an authority, on this subject, he is as much a layperson as my uncredentialed ass.
So even radiometric dating does not prove the Earth's millions of years old, and a lot of tests show it's not.
You're right. Radiometric dating does not show the Earth to be millions of years old. It shows it to be billions of years old. Dad jokes aside, what tests are you talking about that show that it's not millions of years old? The only tests you've brought up were ones that misused the dating methods and ignored both contamination and background levels produced by the equipment, and if I ignore the severe methodological flaws with those tests, they don't actually show the Earth to be young. They show problems with the dating methods that they used. But before radiometric dating was even developed, geologists had already concluded that the Earth was around 100 million years old, mostly from the study of stratigraphy. So if we ditch all of the radiometric dating methods, we still have an Earth that is at least 100 million years old. But actually, radiation has an impact here aside from using isotopes to date the rocks. The 100 million years was based on a mixture of what we know about how rocks form and a calculation of how long it would take the core of the Earth to cool. The discovery of radiation as a mechanism for keeping the core of the Earth hot is what resulted in us calculating an age for the Earth in the billions of years. The fact that radiometric dating confirmed that calculation doesn't change the fact that we know the Earth to be billions of years old, even without radiometric dating.
Just look at Grand Canyon. Look at those layers, those beautiful flat layers laid down one upon another like a stack of pancakes. It's really funny though, because most of the time in that wall of Grand Canyon is in the gaps between the layers, where the evolutionists are saying that these rocks were above the ocean, subject to the atmosphere and erosion, and then the ocean came back and laid down this shale or laid down this limestone. But there might be a 30 million year gap in there with no evidence of erosion. Meaning there wasn't 30 million years, or there would have been canyons and all sorts of things in that flat layer that should have been eroded.
Amusingly, 2 layers that are often used as an example of this missing time with no evidence of erosion between them are the Muav limestone, which sits directly under the Redwall limestone, except where it doesn't. The Temple Butte Formation is made up of rock that was deposited into what were valleys when the Muav limestone was at the surface. You know, valleys, a feature of erosion. But yes, for the most part, there is evidence of missing time in between those 2 formations. This is called an unconformity. Somewhat ironically, unconformities happen because of erosion. An area that was once protected inside the Earth is uplifted and exposed to the environment and eroded away. If no deposition is happening during this time, then the result will be a relatively flat contact between the older strata and whatever strata is formed in the next depositional environment to encroach on the land.
So if most of the evidence of time is in the gaps, and the gaps show no evidence of time, the millions of years isn't true.
The gaps are not where most of the evidence for millions of years are. But more importantly, how do creationists account for the unconformities in the Grand Canyon? Take the Grand Canyon supergroup layers, for instance. They are a group of layers with unconformities on both sides, and they are at an angle to the rest of the strata in the Grand Canyon. Because of the law of original horizontality, we know that they were not deposited at that angle. That happened later. And because their contact with the layers both above and below them are smooth, we know that they had to be fully lithified and exposed on the surface for a long period of time in order for their surface features to be eroded away before the deposition of the Tapete sandstone on top of them. In order for that to happen as a result of Noah's flood, several layers would have to have been deposited, had time to fully lithify, that is, solidify into rock from whatever sediment originally made them, then go through a geologic upheaval event of some kind that tilted them, then be exposed on the surface for long enough to erode them flat, all before having another layer laid down on top of them in the same flood that created them in the first place.
A better solution is that these things were laid down during Noah's flood, one upon another, boom, 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 and actually the time is not there, just like the rocks tell us.
So how'd the supergroup get tilted? How'd raindrops get fossilized in any but the highest layers? Hell, why is it that the majority of the rock types are ones that need relatively shallow environments to form in? And what of the ones that show evidence of forming in a dry, arid environment? There are too many distinct depositional environments in the Grand Canyon for them all to be accounted for by a single giant flood.
Were the rocks formed quickly?
Yes, the rocks are formed quickly, laid down quickly, one upon another during the flood year.
What might a quickly formed rock look like?
Well, it might look like a sandstone. Specifically, a lot of the sandstones in Grand Canyon, when you look at the angle at which there's these like cross bedding, they call it, these diagonal lines in the rocks, that's formed from water flowing over sand and piling it up, and it makes these mounds underwater. And the mounds stack up on top of each other at a certain angle.
That happens both underwater and in arid conditions where the sand grains are being deposited by wind. There are 3 problems for creationists here. The first is that they take a relatively long time to form. There is no way that dunes the size of the ones in the Coconino Formation could have formed in a single year, and that's not even considering that this is only one depositional environment of dozens that need to work their way through the Grand Canyon area in that single year. Second is that cross-bedding that is formed by water is fairly uniform. The dunes all face the same direction, because that's the direction of the current. The Coconino Formation has cross-bedded units that are aligned in many directions. And yes, the average crossbed angle is closer to what would be expected from water, but the crossbed angle for aeolian deposition, that is by wind rather than water, is a broad range that also fits the Coconino Formation. Their third problem is that there are vertebrate footprints preserved on the sloping surfaces of the crossbedding, which show no signs of the washing or slumping that would indicate that they were made underwater.
Just go to creation.com, type in sandstone, limestone, or type in bent layers.
Oh, goody! I'm going to be able to bust out my crayon experiment again.
Okay, tell us what those are.
If rocks are hard, which we'd expect them to get very hard over billions of years, you can't bend them.
Come on, everyone knows that the older something is, the less likely it is to be able to get hard.
They'd snap, they'd fault, they'd break.
Right.
Fun fact, earthquakes are actually the result of cold, hard rocks behaving somewhat elastically. They bend until they reach their breaking point, then they snap and unleash all of that built-up energy. So yes, cold, hard rocks can and do bend. If they couldn't, then we wouldn't have big earthquakes. It would be more like a constant series of tiny, almost undetectable earthquakes.
But we see massive areas of multi-stacked rocks with different layers, different colors, and they're bent like taffy.
Yep. Doesn't work for the creationist model.
How did that happen?
Well, they had to bend while they're still soft.
The problem for creationists is that when they say still soft, they mean not yet lithified, meaning that in these scenarios, we'd expect to see massive amounts of contamination between the layers rather than the clear divide that exists out here in reality. But yes, they were bent when soft. Not still soft, but softened by heat and pressure. Let's look at the crayon experiment. A crayon at room temperature is brittle. If you try to bend it, it won't go very far before snapping. The melting point for Crayola crayons is about 50 degrees Celsius, but if you put some in water at 40 to 45 degrees for a little while, it will soften, allowing you to bend it almost entirely in half. Then allow it to cool, and now you have a crayon that is once again stiff and brittle, but bent.
And the only way for them to be soft when they bent is if they were laid down quickly and then bent before they hardened.
Or laid down slowly, and then through geologic processes that we can still see working today, they were subducted into the Earth's mantle, which I will remind you is not molten, but is solid rock that is hot enough and under enough pressure that it behaves like a viscous fluid. And hey, would you look at that? It behaving like a viscous fluid allows it to bend without breaking. Then when it works its way back up to the surface, it cools and solidifies into its new bent form.
So the flat layers that we see And the flat layers that have been bent and twisted around like they were still soft, those things are both telling us that the rock record is not millions of years old.
Only if you don't understand the first thing about geology, or you're lying about it. Though, given the fact that this guy is making Matt Powell level arguments, I'm going to say that he's just way out of his depth when he leaves his field of expertise, so he just doesn't understand it. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's the impression that I get.
Okay, speaking of the rocks, I want to talk about some really big rocks, and that would be the Rocky Mountains.
Yes.
Okay, so they are significantly taller and higher than the Appalachian Mountains.
Yes.
So how do you explain the disparity between the two?
They are two different mountain ranges that formed by different geologic events at different times and existing in different environments. Why do you think they should be identical? Oh, I guess it's because y'all think that all of the mountains had to form in the same event. So, yeah, I guess having mountains that are clearly significantly older than other mountains is one of the ways that we know, at the very least, that the Earth has to be older than 6,000 years.
Well, it's really kind of funny because in the evolutionary model, the Rockies, the Andes, the Alps, the Himalayas, other mountain chains in Southeast Asia are all geologically very young.
Yes, so young, in fact, that they are still in the process of forming. That's why Mount Everest gets a little taller every year.
Late flood mountains. The mountains started coming up and helping to drain the flood waters off the continents.
Oh, so your explanation for how one mountain range could appear significantly older than another is that the older one formed at the beginning of the flood, allowing the floodwaters to erode it more than the mountains that formed at the end? Okay, aside from the fact that that has zero face validity, we can now turn to creationist geophysicist John Baumgartner, who calculated that the amount of heat that would have been produced if all the tectonic activity that real geologists agree happened over billions of years were condensed into the single year-long flood would have been enough to boil away a layer of water 25 kilometers deep over the entire Earth. What was his solution to that problem? Easy. He concluded that God must have monkeyed with the laws of physics in a way that is too subtle for us to detect. To translate out of creationistese, magic. You are welcome to believe these explanations if you like, but don't pretend that they are backed up by science when creationist scientists have to publish papers explaining how magic is necessary in order to account for what we see today.
These rocks are really young. Even the evolutionary model, they're really young. So we get to ask the question, how come the Earth started building mountains all of a sudden?
It didn't. You're ignoring the part of the question where she explicitly brought up the Appalachian Mountains, which are over 400 million years old. And they're not even the oldest. The Barberton Mountains are over 3 billion years old.
All the major mountain chains in the world, except a few exceptions, are really young.
So, if I ignore the old ones that you know about and are telling us to ignore, then all the mountains are young. Which in this case means younger than 65 million years based on his comparing them to when the dinosaurs went extinct in a bit that I skipped. Therefore, the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Do I have that right? Now, I'm skipping a bit ahead again. She just lists categories of things that he's covered so far before asking him this.
Okay, give us something that's not quite so scientific.
All right, let's do something really easy.
That would be everything he's said up to this point. But let's see what he goes for.
Can you multiply by 2?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great.
Oh, fuck me. This is just going to be the population growth argument, isn't it? Well, at least they're explicitly acknowledging that it's not scientific.
Let's multiply by 2 many times. We get asked this question a lot. How can there be 8 billion people in the world? If we started off with Adam and Eve.
Right.
I mean, 6,000 years ago, that's not a long time. It's even worse than that.
Yeah, there it is. I don't think we need to listen to him explain it. It is one of the stupidest creationist arguments that there is. If you're unfamiliar, it assumes that the time it takes for a human population to double has remained constant throughout history and is not impacted by things like resource scarcity, disease, or war. They will start with the current population and then figure out whatever doubling time they need to in order to get back to single digits over 4,500 years. In these guys' defense, they at least attempt to make it sound more reasonable. They make it more about limiting how fast the population had to grow in order to get from Noah and his family to 8 billion people, so that they can say, see, we made a conservative estimate and there's still lots of headroom. And then when looking at the evolution side of things, they make it more about the lack of human remains that we've found. But this doesn't really fix it, as now instead of ignoring famines and wars, you're ignoring decomposition. So that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Chad Anderson W8V, who says, I'm fine being respectful to them, but stop calling me cis. Well, Chad, I'm glad you're respectful of trans people, but there's a misconception here that needs clearing up. It's not cis S-I-S, it's cis C-I-S. The only thing that cis means with respect to gender identity is that you are not trans. It is merely a descriptor used to distinguish between the two. It'd be no different from calling you tall in a discussion about height. In most scenarios, referring to a cisgendered person as cis will not be necessary, but when it is used for clarity and precision. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Piper for being my editor, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the marine biologists pontificating on the geology that is my channel. If you'd like to be out of your depth, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my PO box address is in the description. See you next time!